Well, good afternoon, wherever you might be. I am Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, coming to you live here from the Dean's Conference Room on our Malibu campus, and delighted to welcome you here to the third session of our four-part webinar series, No Way to Treat a Child. From the beginning, this series, led by Naomi Schaefer Riley, has explored a truly important and often overlooked area of public policy, and that is the array of foster care and youth service systems around the country. This is truly one of those areas where, for people of faith, such as myself, that the importance of people of faith being engaged, first being informed, but then involved in responding to what could only be called a public policy crisis for those really in the greatest area of need is so important. And with that, I'm delighted to welcome in the moderator of this four-part webinar series, who will bring in today's guest, Naomi Schaefer Riley. Naomi?
Thank you so much, Dean Peterson, and welcome back, everyone. My name is Naomi Schaefer Riley. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where I study child welfare. And I am pleased to have with us today Jedd Medefind. He is the head of the Christian Alliance for Orphans. And you can read a little bit about his bio here. He used to actually, before this, be involved with the White House Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. And we're going to talk a little bit about what CAFO does. So welcome, Jedd. I really appreciate your joining us today.
Thank you, Naomi. Great to be with you.
So just to sort of give folks a little bit of background, I mean, our last two sessions, we talked a little bit about kind of the child welfare system as a whole. We've talked a little bit about family courts, and most of our focus was on kind of public policy and the sense of what government could be doing, should be doing better, and what the government's role is in helping kids who have been abused or neglected. And today, more of our focus is going to be on the question of what regular citizens of this country could be doing, particularly those who are involved in churches or other faith-based organizations. But I guess we first want to kind of understand, Jedd, what is the relationship here between the kind of the private nonprofit sector and the government when it comes to helping these kids who are, in the most vulnerable positions in our society?
Yeah. Well, Naomi, one thing I love to always emphasize when we talk about these things, and particularly begin to talk about the role of the church and faith organizations, and then the broader role of government and how those things fit together, is just looking specifically at the Christian tradition going back 2,000 years, and of course drawing heavily upon the Jewish tradition before that, of a deep commitment to children that the world in many respects would have been happy to forget or leave to the side. And in the ancient Roman Empire, the Romans had a way of getting rid of unwanted babies called exposing. So if a child was unwanted because it was malformed, or perhaps the wrong gender, or maybe just came in at an inconvenient time, it was perfectly acceptable practice within Roman society to take that child outside the city and sometimes actively drown them. And then in other cases, to just leave them there. That's what exposing meant, leave them there for wind and rain and wild animals to do the work. And the early Christians, although they were a small and sometimes persecuted minority in that Roman era, they earned a reputation for going outside the cities to look for these exposed babies, and finding them. They would pick them up, clean them, wrap them, and bring them home with them, and often find placements for them where they could find a family, sometimes raise them as their own children. And so this commitment to children that the world has pushed to the side, this is something that has defined the Christian faith, since its earliest days. And you even see in those centuries as well, you see early documents governing the church where actually, for someone to be even considered as a candidate for leadership, they needed to be known as someone who loved orphans. This was actually written in some of these early documents, and you see that same
babies.
Yeah, that's right. All throughout history, you see that same thing, and even many of the people who I imagine many on this call would be familiar with names like Amy Carmichael, Hudson Taylor, Charles Spurgeon. These were leaders of Christian faith throughout the centuries. In addition to whatever else they were doing, they very often were involved in caring for orphans, or maybe they adopted a child themselves, or they were somehow seeking to help orphan widow families to be able to thrive together. So this is something that goes back 2,000 years and beyond. And at the same time, I would say there has been a kind of a modern resurgence over the last couple decades of people motivated by their Christian faith saying, hey, what does it look like for me to be a part of that ancient commitment, and really which flows out of a very clear scriptural call to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and of course, in addition to that mandate, that clear call in Scripture, you have, within the Christian narrative, the Christian story, right at the heart of it is the gospel, which is the idea that God has sought us out when we were in a very real, sense, destitute and alone and in great need. He has sought us and drawn us into his family. And so that animating vision is really for 2,000 years has motivated Christians into this space. And again, we're seeing this resurgence today, which is a really beautiful thing. So that then, kind of steps into as they're stepping into this, they're stepping into a public sphere, because the government, of course, has this role for determining if a child needs special protection in our society and those sorts of things. So we could dig deeper into that, but I thought that'd be a good kind of historical backdrop.
Yeah. So obviously in the Roman times, the government was not so concerned with these children who were being left for exposure. And it was the role of the Christian community or Jews to sort of, go of their own volition and find these kids. And now, we have a system in this country where we're trying to figure out, which kids are being mistreated by their caregivers. So can you just sort of talk about how the organization, maybe describe some of the organizations that are part of the umbrella organization CAFO, and how maybe at the beginning of that process those organizations are stepping in. So before we're talking about foster care or moving a child, what are the organizations and what are the churches doing to help vulnerable families that are sort of on the verge of kind of being connected with the child welfare system and struggling, but maybe not, having had a kid removed to foster care just yet?
Yes. Yeah. I think we can think of it as in essence, a continuum of care that begins, ideally long before a child would ever be entangled with the child protective system of their era or their area, right? And so we sometimes refer to this as family preservation or family strengthening. Sometimes it's called prevention work. And the goal is that children not end up separated from their parents and in the child protection system to begin with. And so there's many organizations working there. And, I would say, Naomi, through one lens at least, much of Christian endeavor to serve human needs or is actually prevention work, in a sense that, every addiction recovery program, they're working with parents, and those parents, they're going to lose their kids unless they get off those drugs. That's where they're headed, right? Very often. And so, there's addiction recovery programs, there's homelessness programs, there's prisoner reentry programs, there are, job training programs. All of these things in one sense are, we could say, prevention work. Now, there are some organizations that really are focused on those situations where it looks like a child is headed toward the child welfare system right imminently, and that's where they're involved. And so that would include groups like Safe Families, and there are a number of other groups like them that are in that space where families or the single parent often is in crisis. They may already have been contacted by CPS. There's a real risk of losing their child. And that organization recruits volunteers, primarily within churches, families who say, hey, we're willing to receive that child temporarily. And this is not formal foster care. This is entirely nonprofit run, entirely volunteer run, so that no one's actually getting paid for this. but they receive this child, and the hope is to give that parent a chance to, get on their feet, perhaps get off drugs or other substance abuse, or stabilize their lives so the child doesn't end up in the child welfare system. So that's at the front end. And then, as you alluded to, these organizations, there's others that are involved, when a child is in the child welfare system. So everything from actual foster placement, adoption placement, but also at the same time working with biological families that are trying to get back together, supporting, helping them in that. And then, of course, at the back end, you have, once a child has either A, been returned to their biological family, there are organizations that support those families, or B, if they're in an adoption situation where they've been adopted into a new family, or perhaps with kinship placement, there are churches and others that are supporting those families. So really we see Christians engaged in this full continuum from before the system, in the system, and after the system as well.
Yeah. So I wanted to, just before we get into kind of the some of the foster care and adoption aspects of this work, talk about the history, not quite Roman history, but there was a time, let's say 20, 25 years ago, when I think probably more people thought of Christians as being involved in international adoption, and that was a big focus of a lot of churches, adoption from Russian orphanages or other places around the world. And then there was a time, probably about closer to maybe 15 years ago or so, where a lot of churches became much more interested in questions about foster care in the US and adopting children out of the foster care system. Can you describe a little bit of that history, kind of how that change happened, and what sort of brought the foster care system to the attention of so many Christian communities?
Yeah, that's a great observation, Naomi, and that is accurate. I would note that, so the organization that I get to lead is called the Christian Alliance for Orphans, and it's a very broad coalition of, there's more than 200 organizations that are members, and they all work together through CAFO, we call it, Christian Alliance for Orphans. And it has always included 3 different distinct kind of categories. One has been international adoption. One has been international care for vulnerable children and families. So organizations that work around the world with children in these other countries, including groups like Compassion International, that helps with education and other costs, and a wide range of the international. And then domestic organizations, organizations working here in foster care, in family strengthening and things. So there always has been that full gamut of those 3 broad categories. But as you noted, about 20 plus years ago, intercountry adoption really was, it generated a lot of energy and attention. Both, the broader culture was noting it. Intercountry adoption was at its highest point in 2004 in terms of the number of children that were being allowed to be adopted out of other countries, and and of course, committed Christians were a big part of that. They were among the first to receive children, particularly kids with special needs and other difficult situations, and so you had a lot of energy there. And at the same time, you had many people involved in foster care, but what we've seen as intercountry adoption has been more and more constricted by foreign countries primarily, you've also seen simultaneously a lot of growing energy for foster care and engagement with families and children involved with the U.S. foster system. So we've, you accurately described, we've seen a real growth of that over the last 10 to 15 years, and it's been really exciting to see all the ways in which both individuals and families, organizations, nonprofits, as well as church communities have engaged these things together.
So I wanted to sort of start talking a little bit about the changes that many of these faith-based organizations took in their approach to recruiting and training foster parents. So there is, most states report a big shortage of foster parents, and our research suggests that about half of foster parents quit within the first year. And meanwhile, on the other sort of side of the ledger, many foster parents report that when they call a state to volunteer, nobody calls them back. So I was wondering kind of like what is the approach that faith-based organizations are trying to take to bringing more people into this work? How is it different from the way states have done it in the past? What sorts of changes and improvements have been made? And how do you think, and maybe give us an example of a couple of the organizations that you've worked with that you think have been particularly successful in this?
Yeah. Well, as you know, Naomi, all the state systems are different, often even very different at county levels. And so, it's difficult to make broad generalizations. But what I would note is that, when you have an entirely state-run kind of, traditional bureaucracy-centered foster system, they'll advertise for foster parents, they'll put up billboards, they'll try to recruit in that way, but it's just kind of a one-size-fits-all, the way government often does things, right? And what many of these faith-based organizations have added to the picture is two elements. First, on the recruiting side, just ways in which they are going into faith communities and not just kind of speaking the language, but explaining the vision, the call to care for kids in foster care in a way that is deeply connected to the Christian tradition. What we talked about earlier, that this is, when they will explain things like, hey, when the Bible talks about the orphan and calls God's people to care for orphans, in America, that means these kids here in the foster system, right? These are the ones that they may have living parents, but they are growing up without the protection and provision and care that God intends the family to provide. So this is what it means to put your faith into action, caring for the orphan and widow in distress here in America, right? And so they help connect those dots. Of course, the data show that people of Christian faith are uniquely responsive to the invitation to foster, to adopt, to take in kids with special needs, to take in sibling groups. And so this is a fertile place to recruit. Even if you're just looking at it from a very pragmatic, functional level, it's fruitful. And so there's the recruiting side, but then I would add something really critical to that, Naomi, is that, as you noted, a huge percentage of foster parents drop out within the first year. And that's just the simple truth. It is very difficult. You're welcoming in a child who's probably known a lot of hurt. And so you're going to share in some of that hurt with them within your home. So that part of it is very challenging, can be very challenging. You're also dealing with a system that is, in many ways, of course, it's common to say it's broken. I don't think that if you've seen some of the systems around the globe, you maybe wouldn't say the U.S. system is broken.
But keep it in perspective.
Yeah, exactly. But you'd say it's very, very flawed. And the reality is, I think, truthfully, any system that is dealing with the world at its most broken, the system's going to feel broken, even if it's got a lot of really earnest people in it and things like that. But of course, you add to that complications of, well, there's a lot of complications. I won't go into them all, but so the foster system itself is very difficult to just deal with. I mean, I can tell you, as having fostered there in California, a number of years ago, just dealing with the county, dealing with state regulations. We had 5 other children, but our whole life was expected to kind of revolve around this role of being foster parents, which we were very glad to flex, but we also wanted for our other children, to be able to go to soccer practice or to do different things instead of it being treated by the government like we were just hired hands, instead of partners. What we wanted to be was partners in caring for these children. And when we were treated like, hired hands and all of the other facets of our lives were not considered, that made it very difficult. Now, we had a wonderful agency that actually was a buffer between the government and us as a family, and really actually helped a lot. And that's what these agencies do. They support these families. They help with transportation. They help support. And then critically, Naomi, and this is the other piece of the faith community really adds.
Wait, I just want to pause there for a minute, because I just want to sort of explore a little bit more, because I think, until I started doing research in this, I hadn't fully grasped sort of what it meant for a family and a marriage to take in a foster child. Because, there's all sorts of difficulties that you can imagine. But I've spent so much time talking to foster parents now. And, I was at one meeting where a couple of foster parents were talking about their experience. And there were some members of their church there who were kind of listening, and they were aghast. One of their biological daughter was sitting there, and she was recalling kind of all of the things that she saw growing up as a result, or she heard about growing up as a result of the fact that there was a foster child living with them for much of the time that she was growing up. That all of these things that I think so many parents want to insulate their children from and protect them from, and you should never hear about these horrible things. And this girl, who was the biological child of these parents, had heard about this from a very young age, and had her life in a lot of ways was shaped by the fact that this couple had taken in a number of foster children, that she understood what child abuse was at an age when most of us don't want our children to understand that. And the couple talked about how hard it was on their marriage. So I don't want to skip over that part just yet, because the role of the church in kind of helping prepare a family for what they're going to experience, I think, is an important point here.
Yes. Yeah, Naomi, that's so true. And I will say, I think there was a time, you go back 15 plus years ago, a lot of times when people, organizations, nonprofits would recruit in churches, they would really emphasize the positives. It's so beautiful, it's redemptive, you can make a difference in a child's life. And that's really true, actually. I mean, fostering has been one of really the best and most meaningful things that our family has done. I mean, in a wonderful, nurturing, growing way for all 7 of us. We've loved that. At the same time, it's been one of the hardest things we've ever done. So, probably the hardest thing as a whole family together. And I'm thankful that the language, if you look at, whether it's people recruiting or at events like the CAFO Summit every year, the language really now emphasizes, hey, this is a beautiful thing and it's a really hard thing. And, these children, again, have experienced the world at its most broken. They've experienced a great deal of pain. If you open your home and your life to welcome them in, you're welcoming in some of their pain. You're going to share in some of that pain. And that's, and actually, I think for Christians, it's critical to moor this in a theological vision, in the sense that, that just avoiding pain, which is a very natural human thing, is actually, that God calls us sometimes to actually head in the opposite direction, to head into difficult situations, and to share, as the Apostle Paul wrote, to share in the fellowship of sharing in Christ's sufferings. So there's a lot of deep Christian history and theology of this idea of choosing to enter into hard things and participate with Christ in his work in the world. And so I think, when done rightly within the Christian community, there's a deep mooring in that theological vision.
Yeah. So I did interrupt you before you were going to talk about sort of the last piece, or another piece of this puzzle that faith-based organizations have been involved in terms of helping foster parents on this journey.
Yes. So I'll just start with that, with just kind of a personal example. I think of a particular day. We received a little guy in foster care. At the time, our youngest was 4 years old. And so we didn't have any baby stuff. But this little guy not only was a baby, he'd been born almost 2 months early. So he was the teensiest little guy you could imagine. And we did not have any of the things that we needed to care for him. And we were scrambling and trying to get things together. Well, people from our church heard about this and started showing up at our house with everything we needed, with little tiny onesies, with miniature diapers, with baby formula, with a diaper genie, with a small car seat, with meals. For months and months, actually, people brought us meals. And I would say that made such a difference on 2 levels. First of all, it was just a practical help, amidst kind of a crazy season of life. It was very life-giving to have that help. But on the other hand, it also just helped us feel we're not in this alone. In times when we kind of felt exhausted, like this little guy had a hard time sleeping for the first many months. And so we weren't getting a lot of sleep. And, you can get down and grumpy and all these things, but to feel like other people are in it with you just makes such a difference. So faith communities, both at the church level, as well as agencies, nonprofits that can work to recruit this wraparound, we call it wraparound support, that is really critical. And as a last point on that, Naomi, I just said note, to everyone on this particular call, hey, if you're interested in this field in some way, but you feel like, hey, this season of life, you're called to be a student, or you're not at a place where you could foster, maybe you don't feel like, maybe you'll never be called to foster or to adopt, but you can play a critical role in the life of a family that is fostering or that has adopted, or a biological family that's really struggling. through your church community or perhaps another venue, just being involved in their lives, bringing them meals, babysitting, running errands for them. It can make a world of difference. And I ultimately believe that's how this can become, instead of just a struggling plod for those involved, it can actually become a difficult but wonderfully meaningful experience for everyone who's part of it.
Yeah. And I just want to draw attention to a couple of organizations that Jedd has worked with. So one is called Project 127, which is based in Colorado. And to volunteer to be a foster parent through Project 127, the organizers actually require you to bring along with you, I think it's actually 4 friends to go through the training with you, not the full foster training, but at least a sort of half-day training where they come to understand what it means that you are taking in a foster child and all the ways that they could be helping you. And frankly, they're asked to, be very specific at the end of the training about exactly in which ways they will help you. The other organization that is also part of CAFO is called Care Portal. And it sort of does on a massive scale what Jedd was talking about on kind of a smaller level, which is that your church can sign up to be a part of Care Portal in the community. And then when a child goes into foster care, for instance, the caseworker or the family can put up on that message board kind of the needs that child has, and it sort of goes out in a kind of blast message board, so that if you have the onesies or the stroller or whatever else, you can bring that. A lot of people don't realize, in some places, caseworkers are actually spending their valuable time wandering around Targets and Walmarts, trying to get supplies for these children before they drop them off at someone's home, when in fact, of course, the community has a lot of those things. So just, I went to one of CAFO's conferences a few years ago, and I compared it to sort of going to a Silicon Valley conference just to hear all of the different entrepreneurial ideas that people had for approaching this problem. So Jedd, I wanted to talk to you about, you said this can sort of go from a kind of a small kind of plodding enterprise to something that is much bigger and transformative for a community. Can you talk about kind of the way you think about the numbers of kids and families who need this help, and the supply of families out there who are willing and could be able to provide it?
Yeah. Well, it's, of course, anytime you start talking about deeply human issues and start talking numbers, you're shaving off certain nuances. But with that acknowledged, I would say, so right now there's about 400,000 children in the foster system, and each year more pass through than that number, because some are coming in, some are going out. And there's about 100,000 that are waiting to be adopted, that their parental rights are terminated. They're hoping for a new family, right? So roughly 400,000, roughly 100,000. Those numbers have come down just a little bit. I saw in the latest AFCAR numbers, but that is, there's more than 300,000 Christian churches alone, and of course, many other houses of worship as well. And so even if you were just to have one family in each church receive one child, you would really certainly erase the deficit that's currently there, by a large margin, actually, in terms of quality homes and those sorts of things. And now I would add the caveat that the goal isn't, though, to have one family in each church. It actually would be that there would be a hub of families doing this together in each church. And then in a concentric circle out from that actually within that church, there'd be lots of other families and individuals, singles, retired people wrapping around those families, so that, again, it's not them walking this beautiful but difficult road alone, that it's the community living that out together. And right. And so that's, when, as you know, Naomi, at CAFO, we'll often use the phrase "more than enough." We're aiming to the point where there are more than enough well-supported families for every child in foster care, and and that would include foster families, kinship families, adoptive families, and restored biological families, and that there would be at least the opportunity for strong support in Christian communities around the country for anyone who wanted to make avail of that.
Right. And the more than enough, I think, is important also because, not every foster child is going to fit in with the one family who happens to be available. Some families can take in, infants, and some families can take in teenagers. And so making sure that, there's a critical mass of these families in each community who can do this work. I just want to pause briefly and let everybody know that in about 10 minutes, we're going to start taking questions. You can put them in the chat, and Jedd and I will answer those. But I wanted to sort of return back to kind of the first question I asked, which is about the relationship between kind of the private nonprofits here and the government. I think that there are a lot of people, maybe conservatives, kind of think, oh, these organizations, these can kind of replace our child welfare system. They can do the work, and they're so much better at parenting than the government. And why can't we just kind of leave this work more to them and eliminate this bureaucracy, which, as you said, not only drives foster parents up a wall sometimes, but also it doesn't do a great job of recruiting foster parents. I mean, it has lots of problems. Couldn't this just be done by private citizens like it was in Roman times?
Yeah. Well, so on the one hand, I would say that that impulse of, hey, there would be much less need for the child protection system and is less need to the extent that actually good, committed citizens broadly, and specifically we're talking about the faith community and Christian communities, are indeed caring for their neighbor. So if we have great support for people who are trying to get off drugs, so there's a drug rehab program, there's a support group, and there's others that are wrapping around encouraging him in that, then there's going to be less kids in the system. And so that is true. We can reduce the system, and that's a worthy goal. And of course, so many people are pouring into many aspects of that. At the same time, I think it's safe to say that as long as we're on Earth, there will be situations where parents are not providing a safe home for their children. And in some cases, that's because of actual abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. Sometimes it's severe neglect. And I would add, Naomi, that more children actually die in the United States foster related situations from neglect than from abuse. Neglect is a broad term, and sometimes it does just mean leaving a child in a car, but a lot of times it actually means kind of a sustained ignoring of a child's fundamental needs over a long period of time, and death coming as a result of that. So it's a serious thing. But in all of these cases, given that there will be a need to protect children from harm, as a Christian, I see in Christian scripture and Christian history a clear sense that God has given government the role of protecting the weak and innocent. It's described in Romans as the sword that's there. God has entrusted this to temporal leaders, political government leaders, to wield that authority to protect the weak and innocent. And so that's what really the child protection system is seeking to do. And so I believe that Christians can and should really affirm that positive role, but also not let it overreach, because the wielding of the sword, in essence, is not going to enable a child to thrive, right? And that's what we see, is that we see government can do a pretty good job of stopping something bad that is happening, removing a child from a bad situation. But in terms of providing the things that a child truly needs to thrive, the sense of belonging, the nurture, the connectedness, in a word, the love, those are things government just does not do a good job at providing. And that's why the Christian community cannot just simply outsource its essential role to government. It provides a vital complementary role to the critical but limited role of government in something like the child welfare system.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, I guess it's akin to law enforcement in a lot of ways. I mean, in the sense of, we still see the role of, the need for the role of police officers, even if we also think it's important to have soup kitchens and homeless shelters and all these other things that could be protecting vulnerable people. There's also a sense in which, the government is serving an important role here in enforcing the law and preventing, people from being victims of crimes, whether it's child abuse or other sorts of crimes. One question that, certainly comes up a lot, and this feels like it's a role that a lot of faith-based organizations are trying to play, is what about the kids who are aging out of the foster care system, who have reached adulthood, in some states that's 18, in other states that's closer to 23, but who, have been removed from their families, who have not been able to reunify with their families, and who have not been adopted. And so they're essentially, entering adulthood without a family of their own. What are the things that the faith community can be doing to help those young people and prevent the outcomes that so many of them are facing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Naomi, and it is critical. Every year, somewhere around 20,000 young people do what's considered aging out of foster care into adulthood without having a permanent family, and in some cases they will eventually reconnect with kin and things, but others will not, and at the very least they're negotiating those very just kind of sometimes helter-skelter years that we've all experienced in that transition. I mean, I had a wonderful family supporting me, but there were just, so many questions and just trying to figure out applications.
So many questions.
Oh yeah, and just those intangibles of having someone to call up when you're, just trying to figure out how to like get electricity to your house and you've never done that before, or figuring out the FAFSA, figuring you're feeling a crisis in some area of life and you need someone to talk it through. Another thing is just a place to go home for holidays, right? Just what a good grounding thing it is, even if someone has a hard relationship with their family, to be able to go home and these are people to whom I belong and they can't turn me away, or blood. That is so critical to every human life. And so imagine, you've graduated from foster care and you're in adulthood, but you don't have any of those things. And you're trying to negotiate this completely on your own, maybe with a couple of acquaintances, some of whom are probably not the best influence. It's going to be really hard. And the statistics bear this out. I mean, the statistics, when you look at, folks who are in their mid-20s who aged out of foster care, they're tragic. Somewhere around 64% of the young men have been incarcerated in one way or another. I believe it's somewhere around, I think it's 68% of the women are on some form of public assistance, if just, one of the alphabet soup of public assistance and many other things. And so clearly this is an immense need. And I would just say, Naomi, the number one thing, I mean, there's a lot of specifics, but the number one thing these young people need is a relationship, a committed relationship that will walk with them through it. And frankly, even when they maybe make a big mistake, if they do get arrested for something, someone who's going to still take their call or maybe pick them up at the station or, still invite them for Thanksgiving and those sorts of things. So I would say there's a lot of things that radiate out from that. Things like, basic advice in terms of finances and things like how do you create a resume and apply for a job, or what do you do when you have a conflict with your boss? And there's lots of practical things, but the core of it is a committed, caring relationship that's willing to go through the ups and downs of those transitional years.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I guess the last question I want to ask you before we turn to questions is, and you started to answer this a little bit, but for people who are on the call who are kind of interested in getting more involved and kind of seeing an up close version of the system, and they're not in a position where they're maybe going to foster themselves, what are the things that they should be thinking about? A young adult, maybe a student today, what could they be doing both to help out, but also because this is a public policy discussion too. What are the things that might help inform their understanding of the policies around child welfare, and ways that they can help at the same time, I guess.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'll mention three specific buckets for that, and very different. One would just be the general bucket of supporting families, right? So, I mean, another little personal story, when we adopted our daughter, there was a retired lady named Lorraine in our church, and she came up and said, hey, I know this is going to be a really intense time for you guys. I would like to do the grocery shopping for you. And that was before Instacart. So this was like, wow, that's amazing, And I mean, it was huge help to us. And every week she'd get the grocery list from Rachel and she'd go and buy all our groceries and bring them to our house. And that was such a huge help. And we felt so loved and encouraged. And we love Lorraine. She feels like family now, you know? And so that type of thing, just whether it's bringing meals, running errands, cutting the lawn, you know, babysitting to allow parents to get a little evening out, like those sorts of things are invaluable, and anyone can do that, you know. And so that would be a matter of finding a family in your church or someone else that you know, just coming alongside them and helping in that way. So that's A. A second category is the reality that the skills a person has can often be directly applied as well. You know, so in Colorado, there's an orthodontist who does something he calls Ortho 127, you know, named after James 127, look after widows and orphans in their distress. And he provides free orthodontic care at his practice to families that have fostered or adopted. To all their kids. There's a lawyer, a number of lawyers I know actually, but one in particular in Seattle that does, you know, provides free legal support for families that are in that world. There's actually someone who's a hair cutter, you know, I think she has her own beauty salon, but she does a lot of, you know, haircuts and things for families that have fostered and adopted, and the list could go on. You know, if you know a lot about if you speak Spanish, you know, you could do tutoring for students. And so there's just different ways that particular gifts and skills could be utilized. Naomi, you and I have talked about, you know, that there really is a need for more judges who really care about child welfare, because often the family courts that make a lot of decisions regarding child welfare people see it as a stepping stone. So they're willing to kind of suffer through it for a couple of years so that they can then go do something else. Well, imagine a person saying, I'm going to go through law school, but not so that I can, you know, be a district court judge, an appellate judge. I'm going to do it so I can be a family court judge. That's my sense of calling. And I'm going to become really good at that. I'm going to care deeply about every case that comes in front of me. You know, and man, when you find a family court judge that really cares about the kids and families in that, wow, they can make a huge difference over years or decades. So that's the second bucket. Specific gifts and skills can be utilized in a lot of different ways. Then the third, this is just a real quick hitting thing, is becoming a CASA is really a great way for anyone in any stage of life to form a relationship with one young person in the child welfare system. A CASA is a court-appointed special advocate, and you need to go through a fairly meaningful training process where you learn, you know, you actually learn a ton about the system and all of that, but then you're matched initially with one child and you are their advocate in court and other places, and you're charged with getting to know their heart about things so you can advocate for their interests in a system that often is thinking about all the other interests out there. So, you know, that's just one very concrete way that a person at any stage of life could plunge right in.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to start looking at our questions. The first one, what would be the role of a psychologist in supporting CAFO? I think this gets at really an important question that we talk about often, which is the mental health issues that are going on in the child welfare system, both among the biological parents, which may have led to a child being removed, but also among the child, him or herself, who may have experienced trauma and is in need of counseling in one form or another. So Jedd, can you talk a little bit about like what somebody who is involved in a counseling field might be able to do here?
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean, just largely echoing what you just said, Naomi, but, you know, of course, now I would note the broader backdrop of young people in America today, that there are severe mental health issues right now facing, you know, it appears all youth. I mean, the Attorney General last December declared a mental health emergency for America's youth and all of that. But then you say, if this is true for the whole population, wow, when you hone in on young people who've experienced severe neglect, abuse, their, you know, broken families, being removed from their family, all of those things, they of course are going to struggle even more. And so, you know, that the psychological facet of that, which of course is only part of it, and it's important to acknowledge, I think, the health and healing of any human, and then speaking specifically of children in foster care, it's not solely their psychological aspects. I think that it's important to consider the whole human being and their whole health thriving, but this is a very important part of it. And so whether someone would want to become a counselor within an agency or within a nonprofit organization, or a counselor within the broader child welfare system, on the government side of things, those are both options. I'm also aware right now of two different organizations that are building out kind of counseling practices for the children that they're serving. I think more and more organizations are saying, hey, there's not enough resources out there right now. Like, what they used to do is just send children to a psychologist in town, but they're realizing the needs are so intensive. They need to have in-house resources and maybe even like a whole center that's operating there. So I'm aware of two right now that are just trying to hire and build for this. And I think that will only increase over the years ahead. So, man, if someone, has psychological training and a passion for loving and caring for people in that aspect of their well-being, there's going to be so much opportunity for that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another question sort of asking us to get a little bit more specific on the question of helping kids who age out. So one organization that I visited was in Arkansas. It's called Immerse. And they have a whole program, actually a center for youth who are aging out there, where they provide laundry facilities, computers to help you apply for a job, classes to get your driver's license. And they have also built out a whole mentorship program. They also will help you, not only do they have some transitional housing, but they will also go with you to help you get a lease for your own apartment. And so, I'm not sure, maybe Jedd is more familiar with what's available, closer to Pepperdine. But I think, the key is probably in most of these cases, like, again, finding a way to build those relationships and finding maybe a mentorship program or something like that. But Jedd, maybe you have some more ideas.
Yes. Well, as you noted, there are some organizations like Immerse that provide really that kind of a hub of support that includes many facets to life, right? Including housing and job training and resume writing and connections with potential employers who are willing to kind of flex a little bit to hire someone who's coming out of foster care, things like that. And so, Immerse, there's one in Georgia called Connection Homes, which is also starting to open, more offices in other places. There is one, I can't remember the name of it, but it's centered with a lot of housing-centered services in Los Angeles. I can't remember the name of it right now. But, so there are those, and I think those are really critical because, there are these multiple facets to the needs of an aging out youth. I would also note that there are some that do focus on just connecting a young person with a mentor who becomes hopefully not just a sounding board, but also is helping them think through things like job seeking, maybe starting classes at a junior college, and those sorts of things. And so some of those programs, which are a little simpler, they still are very meaningful. Although, man, something like Immerse in Arkansas is just beautiful.
Yeah. I wanted to sort of just, I don't see more questions right this second. So I wanted to just take my moderator's privilege and ask another question while I was thinking about it. I mean, a lot of the activity around foster care and adoption has really been concentrated in the evangelical community. And I was wondering if you can kind of think about why it is that that's the case, and, and what other religious groups in this country might take from the kind of lessons that you think evangelical churches in particular have learned here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there'd be a lot of threads to that. And I've written, a few articles on some of the history and things. I do think one of the big motivators, frankly, is actually this theological vision that is deep in the evangelical understanding of Christian faith, that God has sought us out in our great need and welcomed us into his family. And so to go and do likewise, whether that's welcoming in a child through adoption, through foster care, or even expressing that and seeking to help restore broken families, this is a deep part of the, evangelical story and theology and commitments. And so that has been a big driver in all of this, and in the earlier wave of intercountry adoption for sure, and in the more, somewhat more recent engagement with foster care. Although, as I've noted, this goes back 2,000 years. It's not new. It's just we've seen this resurgence. In terms of things that other communities could learn, I think one important thing we noted earlier, but that is, I think the evangelical community has matured in a number of ways as it's gone deeper into this work. One of the expressions of that has become, not just talking about the beauty and redemptiveness of foster care or adoption or of caring for struggling families. It really talking in a very full way about both the beauty and the costliness of it, and the redemptiveness and some of the pain and even unresolved stories and messy situations that a person finds themselves in when, as we would put it, when we follow Jesus near to the world's hurting places. That's going to get messy. You're going to share in the pain. And frankly, you're going to also participate in broken situations. You're going to sometimes make choices between two really flawed options. It's not, we all like to think, well, we come to a crossroads and there's going to be a good answer and a bad answer. But in a lot of these situations, when you're thinking about a child's welfare, you're thinking about, do I return them to an abusive uncle, or do we take them out of their biological family completely? Like, neither of those are good answers, right? And yet you either say, you know what, I'm going to wash my hands of it so I can stay clean. I'm going to, and I'm going to go and mail in a check once a month or something. Or you say, well, I'm going to stay involved, and either I'm going to make the hard decision, or if you're a social worker or you're a judge, you're making these decisions. These things get really tangled and really difficult.
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the advantages, or maybe one of the reasons from a sociological perspective that I see so much activity in the evangelical church is just how much it's lay run. I mean, there is no, there's no, I think there's less ability to just kind of, I'll write a check and then I'll be done with it. And I think, in the Catholic Church, obviously there is a long tradition of helping orphans and Catholic Charities, which is obviously one of the biggest organizations in this country that does foster care and adoption in a lot of states. I think a lot of people in the pews sort of think, well, I'm supporting that. But as far as like finding, real life volunteers to kind of step forward, that's a very different ask that we're sort of putting out there in certain communities. And this is something I've talked about. I'm Jewish, and this is something I've talked about. Like, I don't understand why, maybe synagogues aren't more involved in this, or maybe, the Mormon church isn't more involved in this. But it's interesting because it does feel like the evangelical world has kind of blazed a pathway here, and other religious groups can try to follow these models. I mean, why can't other religious groups, also sign up for Care Portal, for instance, and also provide these needs in their community? But it feels like the messaging is kind of difficult in a lot of ways, and I wanted to maybe ask you about that before we go. One weird thing that people ask me when I tell them that I write about this, and that I write about it with regard to the faith communities, are people just fostering and adopting because they want to convert these kids to Christianity? And I sort of thought it was a weird question, but I get asked it often enough that I thought I would just throw it out there and ask you too.
Yeah, thanks, Naomi. I mean, that is one that just sincerely makes me smile a little bit, because to me, it seems to be coming from people who have not fostered or adopted. It's if you're just trying to like win converts or get souls notched on your belt or whatever it is that someone might do, you can go to the park and pass out tracts, and then you can go home and have a quiet, peaceful evening at home, but if, to bring a child who's known immense hurt into your life, I mean, if whether it's foster care, even more so with adoption, you are giving them your family name, you're writing them into an inheritance alongside your biological children, or some of these other things as well, where you are deeply enmeshed, right, in the world's hurt, and you're sharing in that hurt. If you were just trying to kind of like, proselytize, there are far easier ways to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, on that note, I think I'm going to end this. I really want to thank Jedd so much. And I also want, people to really reach out and check out CAFO's website. It's CAFO.org.
That's right.
Because there are so many organizations that are on the website, and they're geographically all over the country. And so you'll be able to sort of find ones in your area that I think might, answer some of the questions about how you can get involved. And I'm going to volunteer that you could reach out to Jedd himself, and that he'll probably even help direct you to the right place. But yeah, I just wanted to thank you for sharing this with us. I mean, it's, the work that, from my perspective anyway, this is sort of my selfish pitch here, which is that, a lot of the writing about policy and thinking about ways that the system can be fixed can be very depressing. But the most fun and optimistic and happy parts of my research have been getting to go and visit some of these organizations and seeing the amazing work that they're doing in their communities and for these kids.
That's great, Naomi. I feel the same. There's so much hurt in our world, and so many things that feel torn and disintegrating in some ways. And yet there are just so many wonderful people. You could call them, community healers, working either, at a kind of a level of nonprofits and organizations and civil society, or just individual families that are caring for one child or one, mother that's struggling, trying to get back on her feet. And it truly is a beautiful thing.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks again, Jedd. And thank you everyone for joining us. We have another one in our series coming up in December. We are going to have Emily Putnam Hornstein come and talk. I believe it is December. Hold on. Don't go anywhere, because it's very important that I tell you this. It is on December 6th at the same time. And so we look forward to seeing you all there. Thanks again.